So pause for a second and take a mental note of what you've been doing for your training and go ahead and see, are your muscle groups balanced in your training, or are you noticing you're neglecting a certain muscle group or movement pattern? From a joint standpoint, you want to be moving optimally in all the different ranges of motion of that joint. So for example, the shoulder joint is going to move a lot more and in many more directions than your knee, for example, just based on the nature of the joint. But you want your shoulder and your knee to be moving throughout its full range of motion that it's allowed to do. The role of the muscles is to support that joint and allow it to move throughout its full range of motion. So you need to train the strength and the control throughout the full range of motion and the body's awareness of where it is, which the fancy word for that is proprioception, but it's just basically where that joint is in space and if your brain knows that it's there. If we don't have muscular or joint balance, where your muscle groups aren't balanced or your joint isn't moving throughout its full range of motion properly, this can increase your risk of injury, especially when you're doing an activity that demands more than what you have. If you're looking for more tips on how to reduce your risk of injury, I have a whole video on that there, so you can go ahead and take a look at it. But all in all, we need both mobility and stability around a joint to have it function optimally to allow you to do the activities that you want to do. To train muscle and joint balance, you need to consider 3 different factors. The first one is consider the different planes of motion. The second one is working through the joint's full range of motion. And the third one is considering the muscle balance around that joint. So going into the different planes of motion, your body can be divided into sections in different planes. So you can go split down the front and go front to back. Right? And then you can come down and then split left and right, and then you can split this way and go up and down, right? So you have to consider moving in or through those different planes. It can get a little confusing on which way you say it and which plane you're talking about, but essentially think about like a horizontal push and a horizontal pull, a vertical push, a vertical pull. Then, so those are more front to back motions where you're going forward and backwards. So you're going the forward and the backward, or the up and the down, right? And then consider the left and right. Consider the side to side motions. Those are gonna be important, especially like for the lower body, your lateral hip stabilizers. They're not often worked when you're training, but adding some side to side motion in that plane can really help you address that common imbalance in the hips. And then you also wanna consider this motion. So the rotation through here, because a lot of your joints are going to rotate, your spine rotates, your shoulders rotate, your hips rotate, even your knees will rotate just a little bit to help lock and unlock that joint. But consider that rotation and how you're using that in your training, because that's still an important part of how you're moving. So consider all 3 directions, so that front to back, the side to side, and the rotation or the up and down in your training, because just training 1 or 2 of these can create an imbalance in your training. So for example, runners often do a lot of forward and back motion and not a lot of side to side motion, and the lateral hips are often weak. So incorporating some of that side to side motion, kind of as I mentioned earlier, can be really helpful in addressing an imbalance there and helping them improve their performance, improve their running speed, reduce the risk of back, knee, hip, and foot injuries. Then you want to consider working through the full range of motion. You want to consider, is it the exercise's full range of motion, or is it the joint's full range of motion? And then is it active or passive motion? So let's take the shoulder, for example. It is one specific joint. You want to have the full range of motion going overhead. You also want the full range of motion with the rotation, but also the going behind the back and extending. So moving it in all different ways, even out to the side motion. You have to consider the shoulder joint itself might not necessarily be the best example because it has a ton of different joints involved in it, like the scapulothoracic joint, which some people don't consider a joint, but anyways, we won't dive down that rabbit hole. But essentially, you want to consider that joint's full range of motion, and you want to train that joint in all of those different directions. And the range of motion might not be even, right? So let's take rotation of the shoulder, for example. You're going to have naturally more external rotation going this way and less internal rotation. Although probably I should have a little bit more internal rotation than this right now, but you're gonna have more external than internal. And that is absolutely normal, and that is the way the joint is supposed to be. So you're comparing it to the normal ranges of motion. Although for some sports, it's more common to be a little bit more hypermobile or have a little bit more mobility. And then you want to consider the type of training that you're doing. So is it more active or is it more passive? And when you have more mobility, you want to pair that with strengthening throughout the full range of motion, and knowing where that joint is in space and strengthening at end range are going to be even more important. Considering a specific exercise as well. So let's start with a pull-up. You're starting with the full overhead motion and then you're pulling all the way, getting the chest to the bar. A lot of people don't straighten their arms all the way at the bottom, so they're losing that shoulder motion that they could potentially be strengthening in and training the full overhead motion. And a lot of people throughout the day don't reach overhead a whole lot, and so in daily life you don't necessarily go overhead, and that can create some stiffness or some tightness that they might not otherwise get in their training or their life. And this stiffness can increase the risk of injury as well. But with any exercise, so for example, like a Cossack squat, that requires a lot of hip, knee, and ankle mobility and adductor flexibility on the standing leg. If you're not able to do the exercise with the full range of motion, then you can modify with the goal of progressing that range of motion more. Proper form is going to be the goal of your training, and then once you're able to do an exercise that might be modified with good form, then you can slowly progress it to the actual exercise, for example, like that Cossack squat. If you are a little bit confused on what area you're lacking mobility or motion in to help with like a squat, for example, because a squat requires a lot of ankle, hip, and knee mobility, but also some mid-back mobility that you might be forgetting about, and depending on the bar position that you're using, it requires some shoulder motion as well. So if you're not quite sure, I do offer individualized movement screens as well, so you can take a look at those if you are interested in kind of teasing out how you're moving. But if you do want to dive into like common mistakes that are found with squatting and maybe some mobility drills, go ahead and watch this video up here that I'll link. Basically, we dove into some common mistakes that beginners make with squatting and went over some form cues and some mobility tips as well there. And then kind of as I mentioned before, looking at the active and passive motion, you might have a lot more passive motion than you do active motion, and the goal is to minimize that active-passive gap. This basically is end range strengthening and then control throughout the full range of motion. Because essentially when we don't have that strength and end range, our muscles can't support that joint and potentially can increase the risk of injury, especially when you're demanding a lot of your body at end range, which is something that a lot of circus artists do, a lot of gymnasts do, and dancers. And depending on the type of training that you're doing, that might be something that you are unintentionally doing as well if you're not properly balancing the strength around a joint. And then you want to consider the balance of the muscles or muscle groups. So going back to that running example, they do a lot of forward and backward motion, but not a lot of side-to-side motion, so their side of the hips and potentially even external rotation is weak. So the external rotators of the hip can kind of help keep the knee facing forward when you're running. So sometimes you'll see that knee collapse inward. You might see this as well in squatting, and that is because the side of the hip is weak. And this can increase the stress on the back, the hip, the knee, and even the foot as well. So it affects more than just that specific joint if that joint isn't balanced, because you might be super strong going forward and back, maybe doing like a hip thrust, for example, but then when you try that squat, which also requires that hip extension, those knees fall in, and we're noticing some movement pattern abnormalities with that. And overall, with any exercise, the goal is load management. So you have a certain capacity that you have at this point in time, and you're adjusting that load based on your capacity. So you don't want to exceed the load depending on your capacity. And your capacity might change as well based on day to day. If you're a little bit more fatigued, sleep, nutrition, hydration, all of that stuff is going to play a role in your capacity. But the goal is to optimize your capacity through your training, and this can be optimized a little bit more if we have the balance around the joint to control it throughout the full range of motion. And if you're moving optimally and more efficiently, then you're going to be able to do more of what you enjoy doing. And that's always the goal, right? So all in all, considering the planes of motion, the range of motion throughout each joint and throughout each exercise, and then also the strength and the balance between muscles and muscle groups around that joint can be super helpful when you're trying to figure out your training to create and optimize a more balanced joint and more balanced body. Having that balance across each joint helps with the load management that you're placing through your body on a regular basis, helps reduce your risk of injury so you can keep doing the things that you enjoy. If you want more on how to optimize a specific joint, so the shoulder, hip, and foot and ankle, those are all programs that I have available for you. And then if you also want to check out this video over here, that will show you how to decrease your risk of injury and share a couple more tips for you if you are interested in that.